Hello, Internet. Welcome to Disorderly Conduct, our radical finance and economics podcast for Tarbell NYC. I'm your host, Alexis Goldstein. Our usual co-host, Jesse Myerson, is still away on the West Coast, probably running around looking for hashtag full communism. But never fear, because we have an awesome episode for you today. First up, I speak with Aaron Goggans about the many problems with profit-seeking. From millionaire landlords in D.C. using the local government to help them get out of rent control, to the EU and Canada trying to get around governmental bans on fracking for the benefit of investors. Then I'll interview Zephyr Teachout. Zephyr is a constitutional and property law professor at Fordham Law School, and she is currently challenging Andrew Cuomo in the race for governor of New York State. Let's get started. I'm very happy to welcome to the show Aaron Goggans. Aaron is a writer, artist, and activist from Colorado Springs by way of Chicago. Aaron is currently an organizer based in D.C. at the Employment Justice Center, a contributing artist at thisplacehasavoice.info, and is the founder of the website wellexaminedlife.com. You can follow Aaron on Twitter at Aaron Goggans, which is spelled AARONGGANS. Aaron, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Alexis. Thanks for inviting me.
So I've asked Aaron to come on to talk about the right to profit versus the right to a healthy community, and whether or not that's actually a question that makes sense. So I would love to dive into this with you.
Great. Yeah, I think oftentimes we set up a sort of false equivalency between individual business owners' right to profit and a community's right to have healthy and safe communities. I think often it's constructed in such a way that any reasonable American is supposed to suggest a compromise, right? So saying we'd like to have great rental protections, we'd like rent protection, we'd like rent to be really low, but if we did that, then business owners couldn't make a profit. And at the same time, we praise business owners for being great American risk takers who invest in America and take risk upon themselves to help America, right? That old RNC, we built that kind of mentality. But at the same time, we actually transfer most of the risk and almost all the financial risk onto individuals without a lot of capital. Mm-hmm. And so you see this replayed on all different levels, right? You see in D.C. Large, millionaire landlords will go to the D.C. tenant court and ask for a hardship waiver because they can't afford to pay the utilities and pay for upkeep on their rent. And so they'll go to the D.C. Housing Authority and ask for a hardship waiver. And basically how that works is they'll say, I need to make my 12% profit. So D.C. has this law that allows you to get out of rent control and to raise rents on people in order to achieve it's in the language of the law up to 12%. But what ends up happening is that council members and business owners justify saying, well, I only made 8%, so I'm getting a hardship waiver for 12. And so what it comes in reality is that we have a law that is now used so that landlords have a right to a 12% profit. And so oftentimes, because the system is set up really terribly, and basically if the hardship waiver isn't denied, it automatically goes into effect. And there's a lot of ways in which it can actually go into effect before the office has had time to review it. And so you'll see rents go up 60% in rent-controlled buildings because the owner has a right to profit. So you see it at that level, and then in community meetings all throughout D.C. and I imagine in other cities, you see homeowners come to ANC meetings and be like, well, you can't put that affordable housing near me because I invested in my home and my property value will go down.
So just quickly, for those that aren't in the district, what's an ANC meeting?
An area neighborhood council. So basically, when D.C. got home rule in the 70s, we created a system in which we could have some hyper-local politics, and you could be represented in your ward through an ANC commissioner. So D.C. is broken up into 8 wards with equal population, and each ward is broken down into ANC commissions. And so what usually happens when development is proposed in D.C. is that developers will take their proposal to an ANC commissioner, a commissioning board and the ANC will vote on whether to support it. And it's sometimes, in a lot of wards, it's actually impossible to build anything without an ANC letter of support. And so it allows the local community to have a lot of control. Unfortunately, in some communities, the only people who go to these community meetings are people with the time and the moneyed interest to show up. And it can be very difficult for low-income folks to make it to the meetings. And also, they're often set up so that low-income folks can't raise their voice and they're asked to leave meetings. I just think this is a problem that we kind of see all throughout sort of the West. There was an interesting article I was reading earlier about Canadian fracking companies suing Canada because Canada said they could no longer frack because of the dangers, right? It causes earthquakes, messes with water, and they sued them for lost compensation, right? Because they felt they had a right to profit. And I think oftentimes in local politics, the right to profit means that communities can't thrive in the way that people would want them to because developers come in and say, well, we could have low-income housing in this neighborhood, but we can't afford to. So we're going to have mixed-income housing, and most of it's going to be market rate, and they find ways to kick poor people out. And it often, like, the justification is like, well, we can't have public housing. That would be insane. Nobody does that anymore, right? When actually public housing works fairly well in places like England that has council houses that still own a large portion of the rental housing. Even though there are problems with council houses in England, the problems aren't typically the high crime concentration of poverty that we assume with public housing in America. And even in America, if you look at even documentaries like Chocolate City, which is a documentary done a few years ago about D.C. and displacement, we have a lot of myths about public housing in America when actually there are a lot of public housing communities that did really well for the people in them, but they were torn down because the land suddenly became valuable or the agreements that allowed them to be affordable went up after 30-year leases.
Well, and it reminds me, too, a friend of mine, Laura Goldstein, wrote a book called A Dream Foreclosed, and she tries to sort of tackle that myth, right, that all public housing is bad and no one would ever possibly live there unless they were absolutely forced to, and talks about actually it often builds a community, and it's an important community, and it's not something that we should just think of as this horrible bad thing, but actually like it's an important part of the last remaining bits of like the sort of social safety net or whatever you want to call it. But I also sort of think about the way that we like to demonize any kind of public support for communities, and we like to lionize any kind of entrepreneurial effort. And it sort of goes back to your original framing, right? Like, why does the right to profit conflict with the right to having a healthy community? And to me, it just kind of comes down to the fact that we have decided to sell off basically chunks of the state and chunks of the government to the highest bidder. And you see it everywhere, right? You see it in, I think it's Chicago, where they sold off the parking meters to like a bank.
Yeah, that was terrible. And then the prices went up, and now nobody can afford to park unless you're really rich.
And now in Detroit, like, they're doing all these water shutoffs for people that are late on their water payments more than, I think it's 150 days. But the problem is the cost of water in some of parts of Detroit is like 20% of your income.
Absolutely.
And so if affordable housing, the like federal designation for affordable housing is it's 30% of your income, how are you supposed to pay then 20% of your income for water?
Yeah.
And a lot of people are talking about, well, it's just basically a ploy so that they can eventually sell off the water system to private industries and probably gentrify Detroit and kick everyone out and, rebuild it from scratch. But I really like this idea of, like, why do we accept this framing? Why do we just sort of sit back and say, no, people do have a right to profit, even if it causes displacement, poverty, homelessness? Yeah,
I think Detroit's an interesting example because part of the reason they're shutting off water is actually just because it's not super expensive to give one person water in Detroit. It's not that like the system is crumbling so much that it just got more expensive. It's that there's oftentimes just like one family on a block, and you have to give utilities to the entire block. And so part of what they've been trying to do for 10 years is get people to move out. But Detroit, for a lot of people, and especially for black people, was sort of the last place that a certain class of Americans were able to get their piece of the American dream and actually be homeowners, own a car. And so those families that live on that last block will not sell because it's not worth enough to move to a nicer place. And they worked really hard to get that house. And so there's all of these neighborhoods, right, where there's just like one lady on the block and they're feeding utilities to all of them. And it's interesting because I think we frame so much of our economic conversation under this like myth that America achieved meritocracy. Right? Like in every stage of American history, meritocracy was always achieved 30 years ago, right? Like after women were given the right to vote, 30 years later, we're like, yeah, it's a meritocracy now because they can vote, right? And so whenever we buy that hook because of, a major progressive movement a few decades before.
Or President Obama's elected, we did it, we beat racism, meritocracy has finally been achieved.
Right. After that, after we accept that, then of course poor people are poor because they're lazy and stupid, right? Because it's a meritocracy and you rise by your merits. And so you think, well, hey, I work hard. I'm a smart guy. So I should be able to make a profit off my work, right? And we kind of, that's the narrative that the sort of incredibly wealthy class of Americans kind of push on us and we all accept, right? I mean, it's a comforting idea. I would like to believe that it's a meritocracy. I would like to believe that poor people, all they have to do is work hard and they'll move ahead. But unfortunately, that's not the truth. There's, systematic and cultural barriers to advancement in America. And I think that's a big part of the problem and how we even can have these conversations, right? Because at some point, we have to decide whether or not people can just make as much money as they want, right? Like every system is set up in the so-called free market that if you have capital, you can just gain. And if you sell a better product, more people would buy it, right? And this idea of like eternal, of the like meritocracy in the markets, right? That is ideas and being able to produce something cheaper and better when actually like capital is kind of all that matters in American democracy, right? You can just advertise it better. You can sell it better, right? There's whole companies that don't change their products. They just change their marketing scheme because they have the corner share to do it, right?
Well, and it's not just marketing. So later in the show, we talked to Zephyr Teachout, who's running for governor in New York, but she basically wrote a paper, a white paper about basically how concentrated economic power is almost the same as having political power because you have the ability to lobby and influence regulations. And we talk about how a lot of companies don't innovate anymore and they don't try to make good products for their customers because it's more expensive to do that than it is to lobby for a loophole that is custom made for their business. Yeah. And so they just carve out some little niche market in the law. Yeah. And so they don't even, like this idea that they're being better competitors and they're serving customers better is actually just a lie. Yeah. It's just they have power, they're wielding power, and through that wielding of power, they're able to make a profit. But they sell us on this mythology, right, that they're doing it better, yeah, and they deserve their wealth, yeah, when really they just know the right people.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think like I have a very sort of radical political analysis that kind of like leads me to just think, just take their money. We're just like a 99% wealth tax. But I think like you don't even have to get that radical to kind of think about common sense, right? I always fight against sort of common sense solution to political problems, but I think in some cases in our housing market, that's what it takes, right? If you think about intentional communities throughout America, there's a lot of examples of people providing housing to poor people by saying, look, like the Catholic Church, this is Catholic workers. I'm going to buy a house. This house is going to be given to me, and we're just going to rent it out to homeless families, right? And that seems like a radical idea until you realize that DC sells its property to developers for $1 all the time, right? And they could very easily sell it to a group of well-intentioned people to just provide housing for the poor, right? And that seems like a radical idea, but it's actually really practical. The Catholic Church gives houses to people, and sometimes those communities stop being religious, and the Catholic Church just says, hey, yeah, we'll let you do that. Like I lived in a Catholic worker in Chicago that was definitely very progressive, but was not related to the Catholic Church at all. And it's kind of funny to me that the Catholic Church does something more radical than our mainstream government can ever conceive of doing.
Well, it's interesting because I guess, like, on the one hand, I think that that's a really good, like, common sense, like you said, solution. But the one thing that worries me about that kind of thinking is that I feel like that's very palatable to, like, capitalists because they want to be like, well, but we have charity. You know what I mean? Like, right. And it's okay because the Catholics will take care of people who are destitute, or I'll create a philanthropic organization. Right. And so how do you, and I think, your proposal is not just that, right? You're talking about instead of the government or the DC government, for example, selling money to developers, we could sell it to charitable organizations. But I guess my question is, how do we do more than just rely on the charity? And how do we make sure there's a partnership between the public and people that want to do more radical things.
Yeah, I think it's about reconceiving what charity means, right? Charity doesn't necessarily mean we're just rich people who are going to give to poor people, right? There are nonprofit developers in D.C. that run low-income housing basically at cost, right? And I mean, you can call it charity, you can just call it another model, but that's another thing we can do. I don't think we have to rely on those like 5 do-gooders to, do housing, which was like the 1920s progressive model. I think we can say, like, we have developers who know how to do this. There's this myth that the private industry, millionaires are the only people who can do housing, when I feel like Mikasa and Mana have shown in the history of DC, there are 2 nonprofit affordable housing companies, that if they have the funds, they can run really good supportive housing for low-income people. And not only do Mikasa and Mana build housing, but they also bring in what's called permanent supportive housing for people out of homelessness, and they can bring workforce training and actually raise people out of poverty, right? But they have to have a lot of capital, right? Because we've developed a system in which, land becomes really expensive and buildings become really expensive, and we just don't give capital to them. Instead, we give tax breaks to the people who already have capital through things like the low-income housing tax credit. And we only allow people who already have capital to distribute it to poor people, which just seems like a terrible system.
So to talk about a different example that you mentioned before, you were talking about Canada and fracking, and there's an article that you sent me that's basically there's like a trade agreement, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement between EU and Canada that basically says that Canada can't really fight back against fracking, and they don't have like a right to really like sue, which reminds me of what I've been hearing coming out of some of the negotiations over TTIP, which is another trade agreement where it's a similar thing. Like there's this rumor that they're going to not allow lawsuits and everything's going to go through forced arbitration. And it's basically a way to sort of insulate companies like BP or Exxon from basically being sued within an inch of their life if they do another oil spill. And so how do you see this? And obviously that's a larger question, but given this overarching philosophy that risks are externalized, right?
Yeah.
And we don't take them into account when companies figure out their profits, like what's the solution there? I mean, one solution I can see is those risks should not be externalized. It should be factored in to the profit margins of the oil companies, and they would probably pretty quickly not be profitable anymore. Right. But what else do you think could be done in things like that?
I think reclaiming how the public interest is served, right? I think these huge international agreements stem from a time in which American businesses were the way in which America did imperialism, right? We sent down fruit companies to the third world because it was easier to do that than send down troops. And there's this idea that American business, because they were capitalists and we were fighting communists, were always in our interest, right? And we set up this whole system through NAFTA and all these other supranational treaties or whatever, economic treaties, in order to expand America's interest without guns. And it was almost seen as this like compassionate way to spread American influence, right? And it was seen that like corporations can bring freedom. And there were just like all this conflation of crazy imperialistic and capitalistic values. So I think one thing we have to do is just say, parts of an increasing global community and increasing interconnectedness are great. It's great that we have real and meaningful relationships with other countries, but those shouldn't be solely economic, right? We shouldn't conflate the idea that a trade agreement with Ghana is the same thing as having a real relationship with Ghana that is actually going to help anybody, right? And so businesses get to keep coming in and changing, the way nations work under this like outdated model that they're spreading the nation's interest. And I think there's a lot of structural changes that could be made to make this easier, but I'm kind of a big proponent of like the culture is kind of important, and that we need to have a cultural conversation in America about what does it mean to have profit? What does it mean to spread American interests, right? Like that's a thing that doesn't go challenged in the 21st century after, example of how that's never been that great of a thing for anybody.
This reminds me so much. So I forget how many episodes it was, but on Disorderly Conduct, we had a conversation with Gar Alperovitz, and he was talking about, he used to work in Congress, and then, you would always see like the United States and like the State Department trying to be helpful and genuinely trying to be helpful, and think of some good new program, some aid program for some poor country somewhere. But even though people had good intentions, by the time it sort of got on the ground, the corporate interests controlled it. And then it became a mechanism by which to exploit. And his basic point is, it's the same as yours. We need a cultural shift, and we need to start with the United States, because every time we try to do something good in another part of the world, because we have this like deep-seated belief that the free market and corporations are always good, they always fuck it up, and they always ruin it, and it always becomes something bad, right? And you can see this in conflicts, right? Like, I think this is a big part of the reason why people oppose the war in Syria, is because we were like, even if our intentions are good, once we get down there, Halliburton and, I can't even keep track of all the different changing names of what's their name now? I don't even know. Yeah. They've like had 4 name changes by now, but you know what I mean? So but the problem is it's such a part of like the American psyche. I guess, do you feel optimistic? Because I've seen studies, for example, by Pew that millennials have a more positive view of socialism than they do of capitalism. Yeah. And more millennials feel negatively about capitalism than those who feel negatively about socialism. So do you feel any kind of optimism about shifting this? And also, how do we go about shifting it? Even forget about millennials, right? Like, the people in power want to believe this. It's very convenient for them to believe this. So,
this might be a bit of a stretch, but I'm kind of, I think when it comes to aid, and this is kind of going a little bit back to the right to profit, we have this idea that capitalism, like you said, will fix problems, and that we need to go into the other, into underdeveloped countries, whatever that means, and give them the free market, and they'll just pull themselves up, right? And there's all of these like TED Talks about how people have done that, and they realize, no, the people need to tell you what they want, and that's like that was like Generation X and Generation Y big revelation, right? Is that community should tell people with money what to do and what to spend the money on. And this was supposed to be this big revelation. But I actually think that is actually really destructive. And what most of those communities need are for moneyed interests to just leave them alone. That, like, I have a firm belief that people have the ability to figure out their own problems if you just stopping them from organizing. If you allow underdeveloped, whatever that means, countries to come together away from, IMF restrictions on their public policies, away from loan restrictions on what they want to do, people will find a solution to their problems. And they might have to ask people with more resources to help them, but the solutions can't come from them telling somebody with money, right? They have to figure it out. And what is needed for these communities is to kind of step back and think about it. And so one thing that gives me hope about our generation is that you see a lot of creation of intentional space in our generation that I think was absent in generations before us. You see a lot of, you see this a lot in the queer community, right? Where a queer space is now considered to be an intentional space. And I think that's awesome. And you see this a lot, I think, growing in the Black community as you get sort of a disintegration of the unified Black experience, right? And as people are, like, in my generation, are trying to figure out what it means to be Black in this world, what it means to be Black and middle class versus Black and in poverty, and you get this creation of an intentional space, which seems like an unrelated idea, but I actually think it's all connected, right? It's like we're thinking through the habits in our mind that create the terrible structures, right? So, like, whenever we try and go into the third world and change the structure, because we're so used to thinking through the lens of colonialism, through the lens of white supremacy, we just rebuild those structures. Right.
Well, tell me more, though. What do you mean by an intentional space? Like, what is that? Explain it as if someone had never heard of it before.
Yeah, so I think there's, you see, I guess, to separate an intentional space from your everyday space, right? Everyday space, you say, hey, I'm a good person, I'm not racist. So then when I interact with Black people, I'm just going to not be racist with those Black people. I'm going to be myself, right? And that was sort of the Generation Y, like, raised on MLK, just had a dream sort of view of how to not be racist. But an intentional space is to say, hey, wait, we understand that racism is something that exists. It's something that exists in me and how I habitually talk to other people. So it's the difference between when you're talking to a group of Black people saying, how can I remove my privilege in this space? Right? So one example that I give that is kind of something nobody really thinks about is like trains, right? So you're taking a metro in DC. Let's say you take it from Branch Avenue all the way to Greenbelt. So you start in Branch Avenue, and it's mostly Black people, right? And around, I would say, around Navy Yard, you start to get more and more white people get onto a train. And one thing that happens that I only notice because I'm kind of obsessively observant on public transportation is that there's a critical point in which there's enough white people that white people can subtly exert their whiteness in a space and take over that space, right? And so it's this idea that white people will start talking louder about things that they care about and things that they have access to, right? So depending on the community, right, I don't want to make too many generalizations, but talking about access to your condo, talking about going to Starbucks, just like these little cultural cues that tell the space that you're in that, oh, this is your space, right? And if anybody rides a train in Southeast that's mostly black, especially if it's mostly black and young, it's like a different feel, right? And the train feels different as different classes and cultures of people take it over, right? And so the idea of an intentional space is white people get on that train and don't assert their whiteness, don't try and like deal with the uncomfort that they might feel about being white, and don't take that uncomfort and be like, all right, well, I'm just gonna assert my whiteness in order to like sift the cultural conversation of this space. That makes sense?
It does. And I guess, so it's almost, it reminds me, so I just watched this documentary about Grace Lee Boggs, and there's kind of a bit in it where she's talking about, like, wide-scale revolution, right? And how do we bring that about? And then they show her, like, doing community gardens, like, I don't know, doing things with schools. And there's interviews with all her friends who are like, I don't know, like, at first I just kind of thought that these were just projects that were small, and I didn't get why they fit into the larger revolution. I didn't get it, but now I get it. And the sort of argument of the movie, from at least what I interpreted, is it's about transforming yourself and transforming your community, and from that you can then go out and transform the wider society. But so I'm curious, is it a similar lesson that you think in building intentional spaces?
Yeah. So to bring this sort of back, a connection I guess I should have made before, with the right to profit. When you're in that ANC community meeting and somebody is coming to you and saying, hey, I want to build affordable housing, and you're worried about your property values. There's this phrase called "not in my backyard," the sort of like NIMBY activism, right? And so you get into a community meeting and you just say, no, like, I am a homeowner. I like achieved my piece of the American dream. I earned that privilege, and you assert that in a meeting, right? That's like a real world practical time when you can take a step back and say, hey, wait. Like, let's see who else is in this meeting, right? Who could I offend by assuming that affordable housing tenants bring crime to my neighborhood, right? And I think that is where I see our generation doing something remarkable, right? That's when I see our generation, like, yes, hipster white kids in their 20s are still kind of racist, but you see more and more people checking themselves, right? And you see more and more people getting into meaningful conversations about intentional space that I'm hoping will bleed up, right? That when you go to community meetings and you're talking about the business's right to profit, more and more people will say, hey, I like making a profit, but my right to profit shouldn't push out these other voices, right? I should be more intentional about how I make these decisions and actually think about people who don't have the economic, cultural, or gender privilege that I have.
And do you think it comes from like a widening or like an increased awareness of the fact that profit actually a lot of times is illegitimate? Like, where do you think it springs from? Do you think it's just like a larger cultural awareness? Because I feel like, at least I believe, and I don't have firm data to do this other than like just my own experience, but it seems like more and more in the sort of public sphere, we're hearing people do critical analysis that's widely read about, you know what, profit is illegitimate. And it came out of kind of the Occupy movement, the strike debt group, which sprang out of the Occupy movement, which sort of questions the legitimacy of debt, right? Because so many people now have to go into debt to meet basic needs. I think about Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent article about reparations and how, you know what, like, actually, like, it's public policy. Public policy created the ghetto. Public policy is the reason that there is underdevelopment in the black community. I think of Manning, Marable, which comes, many years ago, writing how capitalism underdeveloped, black America.
Yeah.
But so it's not a new idea, but it almost seems like it's maybe more prevalent. So that's my take on it. But I'm curious, like, what do you think is happening that is allowing this to be true?
I think part of the illegitimacy is that people with privilege are starting to accept the idea that there are other ways to do things. And that there's actually this, like, there's before, right, if you are a middle-class white male and you're like, all right, everybody tells me I have to go to college, I have to, graduate, meet a nice woman, buy a house, get my mortgage, and all this, right? And I think, like, at some point everybody recognized that was kind of like an oppressive idea, that wasn't really good for anybody, right? And 1950s men just who bought into that American dream idea just like dealt with how stagnant that idea was with like alcohol and repression and all this violence, right? And I think like as you have a lot of revolutions that like force people to say like, hey, maybe like interracial marriage is not that bad. Hey, maybe gay marriage is not that bad. Hey, like maybe like just like climbing the corporate ladder isn't fulfilling, right? As more and more people start to like break down their mold, I think it's a lot easier to explain to people the structure that allows for that privilege when they start to feel that the structure is constraining who they want to be. And as they see other modes of doing things, it's a lot easier to call what they've been trying to do and what people before them have given them privilege through. It's a lot easier to call that illegitimate when it doesn't feel right to them.
Well, and I really like this idea that it is so individual, because a lot of times I feel like we look at these problems and we're like, how are we supposed to affect trade agreements between Canada and the EU? How am I supposed to do something against gentrification marching on in New York City and DC? But like, I guess the point I'm taking from you, and tell me if this is correct, is like, it all starts with that person at the, you know, ANC meeting in DC who's like, I don't want public housing in my backyard. And if we can change the culture so that people aren't just thinking individually and think that if we can convince people, actually, maybe the profit that you made is just a byproduct of the conditions in which you grew up and a byproduct of your own privilege, that if we can just change the culture, and that's something that can happen as an individual, right? You can have an individual transformation that we can then go off into the world and start to deconstruct this idea that profit matters more than human community. But is that fair? Like, am I taking the right thing?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that like what we should focus on is individuals working together in solidarity from collective action. And there's this idea that a lot of the left has that I respect viscerally, like the idea that collective action is what's important, right? Because like individual decisions can only do so much. But I actually think there is something to be said that like cultural change has to come at an individual level, right? That we changed a lot of structures in the 60s, and that was super important. Like, I'm really glad I didn't go to a segregated school. But at a certain point, we just changed the way we segregated people, right?
That's
because the individuals making policy decisions just allowed cities to get resegregated through other systems. And I think there's a great argument to be made about the deep state. And right, no matter how many people are against war, there's always going to be some sort of capitalist who will make money out of it, some sort of person who just, that's their interest. But I think we also forget how often those things come to light, and the thing that saves a Halliburton, the thing that saves, what was the British bank that was like giving money to terrorists in Iran and they like couldn't fund them?
HSBC or?
Yeah. And just like what actually, like when those comes to light, it's not the deep state that saves them. It's the belief, the cultural idea that, no, that's a bank. I mean, they make money. We know they're bad, but like, I kind of want to be rich someday. Wait,
we can't let them fail. Like, come on, the whole world would go to shit if we let them fail.
That I actually think like, yes, there's a great argument to be made that like individuals can affect certain decisions, but there's a time in which like we have a moment to take action. And it's a cultural belief that like, yeah, I kind of want a little bit of change, but I'm not ready to go radical yet, right? We don't want to give up all of our privilege. We're willing to let maybe more people into our privileged class, but we're not going to shatter it. That is that cultural belief that actually stops change happening from a massive scale. That's my belief. So that starting with the individual, right, allows us that like when we do get these moments, more and more people will take up metaphoric arms and say like, no, this shit needs to change. This is not okay.
So basically we need to have individual transformations in order to lead to a period where we can actually have meaningful collective action to change society.
Yeah, and I think they're both necessary. I think the individual and the collective are necessary, but without the individual transformation, the sort of outcome of collective action will generally just create a new structure of oppression.
Well, and that seems to be what has happened over and over again, right? Throughout history, is we just find almost more and more subtle ways to oppress people and convince them that their oppression is in their own best interest.
Absolutely.
Right? Like one day you will probably maybe be rich if you just work hard, and so people are willing to accept.
It could happen.
Well, we're going to have to leave it at that. This was an awesome discussion, Aaron. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Again, you can check out some of Aaron's work at wellexaminedlife.com. also at thisplacehasavoice.info, and you can follow him on Twitter at Aaron Goggans, and that is spelled AARONGOGGANS. Thanks again for coming on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
Next up, we're going to talk to Zephyr Teachout, a constitutional and property law professor, author of the forthcoming book Corruption in America, From Benjamin Franklin's Snuffbox to Citizens United, and a candidate for governor in New York. For now, enjoy Bust This, Bust That by Professor Kliq, whose Creative Commons music you can find at professorkliq.com.
Fuck the bullshit.
I'm very happy to welcome to the show Zephyr Teachout. Zephyr is a constitutional and property law professor at Fordham Law School, and she is a candidate for governor of New York. Zephyr, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's really a thrill to be on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, and I should just tell our listeners, Zephyr and I actually met during Occupy in a group called the Alternative Banking Working Group, and I owe you a big thanks. And I was working with a group called Occupy the SEC at the time, and you made this recommendation that we should talk to the folks at Americans for Financial Reform, which is this great umbrella group that fights for financial reform, as the name might denote, which was very helpful. So sort of overdue thanks for that introduction.
Well, it was very exciting. You know, the Occupy the SEC was one of the more exciting things that came out of Occupy. Although there are many different areas in which you've seen that impulse show up in society, but because it took this core idea that something was wrong and then built a really practical strategy around it and had real impact on the implementation of the Volcker Rule.
Thank you. To start us out, I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit about your campaign and why are you running for governor, and what is your vision for the governorship of New York?
Sure. As you suggested, I'm a law professor, but I'm also a lifelong campaigns. And here in New York, we have a really strong traditional democratic public that believes in public education, that believes in infrastructure. We have an extraordinary history of affordable, excellent higher education, of great support for small businesses. And Andrew Cuomo, although he has governed as a Democrat, hasn't actually embraced any of these basic democratic principles. So right now, I see a New York that is so far off where it could be with a strong Democratic governor. And myself and my lieutenant governor candidate, Tim Wu, best known as the father of net neutrality, have a vision of a New York where we have an economy that works for everyone. Not an economy that just works for wealthy and well-connected and focuses on the 1%, but an economy that is vibrant, supported, moving forward. We call ourselves traditional Democrats with 21st century ideas. So that's our vision. That's why we're running. We know that if this campaign becomes a campaign about ideas and priorities, we're going to win. But we've got a really tough incumbent that we're taking on.
Well, that leads me, I think, nicely to the next question, which I wanted to dig in a little bit to one of your white papers. This is the one called Corporate Rules and Political Rules, Antitrust as Campaign Finance Reform, because obviously campaign finance plays a huge role in any political campaign, and obviously I think it's probably fair to say that you guys are the underdog, at least when it comes to sort of money behind you, right? Because Cuomo's got a lot of corporate backers. So in the white paper, you make a lot of arguments about this idea that policymakers should explore antitrust as a way to sort of fight back against concentrated economic power. And you talk about how companies, as they get larger, they have this incentive to spend money to influence legislation and regulations instead of actually serving their customers and instead of innovating and doing development. And it reminded me of something I saw on Twitter, actually. The user is this guy, LUK, at LUK, and he wrote, the U.S. government is like a special version of Kickstarter for wealthy people. And I feel like that was kind of like the snarky version in a way of some of what you argue in the paper, but it's also what I've heard from people who work as research analysts at banks, that companies think it's just cheaper to lobby and get a loophole than it is to innovate. And so I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about the paper overall and just this idea of how corporations are spending their money and how we might fight back using antitrust.
Yeah. What the paper explores is an idea that's actually quite central to my campaign. But it's a really old idea in American history. Arguably, it's what we were founded on. The initial Tea Party was actually an anti-monopoly, you could say an antitrust rally. And this is this core idea that the government, the democracy, should be supporting and enabling a fair playing field and a vibrant economy. But in order to do so, you have to be careful that no individual corporate power starts getting so concentrated that it becomes a kind of invisible government where you're responding to the interests of the people, but responding to the interests of individual monopolistic companies. Now, this is a language that was a big part of American history. Thomas Jefferson wanted an anti-monopoly clause in the Constitution. The abolitionists used to have a chant, "Down with monopoly." And Teddy Roosevelt and FDR, both great New York governors, both were strong on making sure that private power, you want to support business, but be careful that private power never became so concentrated that it took over the democracy. So this has been a long-term American commitment that we just started forgetting in the early 80s. And one of the things that Tim and I want to do is, as governor and lieutenant governor, bring back this idea and really support the smaller businesses, entrepreneurs, working families, but use the tools of tax and of antitrust to make sure that business is in its proper role in society.
So is that something that you would be doing at the state level? Like, are there state level antitrust laws, or is that something you would use the plank? So can you elaborate a little bit? Like, do you think?
Oh, yeah, sure. There's something I'm quite passionate about is that there's a lot of attention on the federal level to what the federal government could do to break up the big banks or to stop the Comcast merger. But states have their own power to structure their own economies as well. I just testified at the Public Service Commission hearing in New York. New York has the capacity through the Public Service Commission to stop the Comcast-Time Warner merger in New York State. Granted, it wouldn't stop it elsewhere, but these are basic utility rules that have traditionally been state law-driven rules, and it's important to have a federal component, but there's a lot of power in the states. There's also a lot of power. I use the term antitrust or anti-monopoly sort of broadly to reflect an ethos, a way of thinking. Because once you come at the economy with the vision that we have, and we have this vision of an economy with, in New York, it's very focused on the entrepreneurialism that first and second generation Americans bring as well, but a really vibrant economy with a lot of new ideas, a lot of new businesses, making sure there's always a fair playing field. Once you have that vision, you can use the antitrust ethos in tax law as well. And you'll find that a lot of the ways in which the monopolistic industries are supported, maybe just through certain tax breaks, certain subsidies, or certain rules that make it easier for them to avoid regulation. So it's an approach that you can then apply in a range of areas. But don't forget the state antitrust laws. They're very powerful.
So that leads me to a second question I wanted to ask you about, because I think a lot of the reason that we feel like we need to take this approach is because we have essentially a crony capitalist state where there's this huge concentration of economic power. And obviously much ink has been spilled about the Eric Cantor defeat, but my favorite article about this was written by Lee Fang for the Republic Report, and he basically pointed out that Brett campaigned on an anti-corruption, anti-cronyism plank, and he was even quoted as saying, all of the investment banks up in New York and D.C., they should have gone to jail. End quote. So I'm wondering what you gleaned from the Cantor defeat to Brett.
I take something very similar to the article you just cited for the defeat. First of all, it's very exciting for our campaign because a little-known professor defeats a incumbent who's nationally known. So, the year of the little-known professor, we're excited about that. But it's something far deeper is going on here, which is after the crash of 2008, a lot of politicians just acted like nothing had happened. But for the American public, it laid bare that there's deep inequalities in our political system and our economic system that the politics of 1996 just aren't going to fix. So we call it post-crash politics. And in post-crash politics, so far we've seen Moral Mondays in North Carolina. We've seen Tea Party. We've seen Occupy Wall Street. We've seen Eric Cantor. We've seen Elizabeth Warren. And all of these reflect a new kind of populism and real skepticism about private power taking over governmental power in different ways. And we see our campaign as part of that new alignment. And although there's very little that I would agree with Brat on, there's elements of that critique that I think, working families across the country and certainly across New York are feeling. They're feeling like things aren't fair. I'm out of power. There are bankers who are getting deals that I'm not. I can't start my ice cream truck business as easy as, I can't get loans as easily as I could if I was giving a $60,000 contribution to my governor. And they're feeling that unfairness. And I think it's the job of politicians to give honest voice to that unfairness, but then also present solutions.
Yeah, and I think there was sort of a joke talking about why is it that it has to be an anti-immigration, basically borderline racist candidate that runs on the anti-corruption. Can't we have a true progressive running on that same plank? And so I think people are very enthused by your campaign, and then it's not just Brat out there challenging this.
It's been actually really exciting because there's people coming together from backgrounds that you wouldn't expect in this campaign, and it's a similar kind of alignment that we saw in the second half of FDR's presidency, where you see business owners who are so frustrated because they're getting shut out of an economy that's really choked by a handful of monopolists coming together with social progressives and people who really believe in public education to say, hey, wait, we've got a new alignment, we've got a new vision of what politics can be like. And that's really, really exciting for us.
Yeah, I think the most extreme example I've seen of that is there's a hedge fund manager, Ken Griffin, who's a billionaire, who basically said that we should break up the banks. And this is not sort of like a benign actor, right? Like he lobbies against regulation all the time, but he tried to take on the investment banks. He tried to start his own investment bank. And if a billionaire hedge fund manager can't create a brand new investment bank because the existing ones are too much of an oligopoly, like what chance does anyone else have? So I think you're right. I think you see not just the small business owners, but sometimes even these moneyed interests who just happen not to be part of these larger groups that they just can't compete.
I also think there's something deeper at play, though, which is there are a handful of people who are sort of happy to get theirs and go home and say, okay. But a lot of people in this economy actually want a fair economy. They want an economy that works for everyone. We'd rather be in a more equal society with a chance for new businesses. It's more interesting. It's more connected. There's more opportunities for change and growth and learning. And so when we talk about an economy that works for all of us, we imagine everybody in that economy. And so I think there are a lot of people who've been quite successful who would rather have a more fair economy than the one that we have now.
That's a great point. One last question for you. I'd love to ask you, you served as the head of online organizing for the Howard Dean campaign. And, lots of people have said that, for example, the Dean campaign gave rise to the small donor online fundraising model, and that blogging was sort of an integral part of the political tactic of that campaign. But I'm curious, what is your take on it? And what do you think the political legacy of the Dean campaign has been?
Well, it was a really exciting moment. As you may recall, when Governor Dean at the beginning of the campaign, he was an asterisk, and he was the only major candidate who was opposed to the war in Iraq. 8 months later, almost all the other Democratic candidates had switched and were newly opposed to the war in Iraq. And what you saw is, we can talk about the technical stuff and the work that we did in online organizing, which I'm incredibly proud of. But I think far more important, what you see is that you can really change politics with grassroots organizing and with people coming and speaking up and telling the truth. And that there's real substantial policy power in that. So that is the core lesson that I take from the campaign, less a technical one and more one about the real importance of people organizing and supporting candidates they believe in.
One thing I do think, though, is that it's sort of shown that progressives are really good at building a movement behind individuals, and we're really about the cult of personality, right? Like Elizabeth Warren and things like that. Is there a way that we can be a little bit better at movement building that isn't just about individuals?
Well, I think they're all connected. If you abandon electoral politics, you abandon the greatest tool that we have for changing policy. And if you abandon grassroots organizing around particular issues, you abandon the infrastructure that enables those candidacies to happen and policy to move. So I think you need engagement on all fronts. I tend to be, in all of my organizing, really focused on more directly political work, because these are the tools we've been given. And if you traveled around the world and you see how people have to organize without the capacity to bring democratic primary challenges, it's so much greater. So I tend to think the electoral work is extremely important, but it has to merge with, and it's always based on the base of people who've been organizing for years. Any honest politician will tell you that they are a reflection of things that have been happening at the grassroots level for a long time.
Well, and that's, I guess, another thing I heard about the Cantor defeat. It was about organizing and boots on the ground, and Cantor tried to run a sort of remote-controlled, money-only campaign, and he lost. So I guess it's organizing.
Yeah. Well, one of the keys, I think, is a lot of politicians get really separated from their constituents, and they do in part because they have to spend all their time talking to the richest people in the state and often in world history through the fundraising mechanisms we currently have. It's so important to always be listening and to have these escape valves that allow you to actually hear what's happening in people's lives. And connecting with grassroots organizers and hearing their stories and the stories of the people they're talking to is, I think, really essential well, if you want to win, that's one thing, but if you want to win and change politics, you have to also be listening.
Right. And I think one of my favorite sort of takes on this was from the socialist city council member from Seattle, Shama Sawant, which was essentially that electoral politics can be a tool for movement building. And you know what I mean? It's almost like a head feint, right? Like we're just using this as a means to build a larger movement.
Yeah, no, I think they're both connected to each other. I mean, you see people come out of the woodwork for one thing and then get shuttled into another, and maybe not shuttled, but get inspired to move into and become a leader in another. The key, I think, for what we should demand of politicians is that they genuinely empower their supporters. So we've seen a lot of uses of, you asked about the use of technology, we've seen a lot of uses of technology where technology is just used as a tool to trap information and then to extract the power of the supporters. I think the most powerful campaigns, the ones that have the potential for the greatest change, are ones which genuinely give supporters power to do their own organizing, bring their own imagination, bring their own creativity, and have a lot more trust in the public.
Well, Zephyr, I know your time is short. We really appreciate your time and coming on the show, and we'd love to have you back again sometime soon.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'd love to be back.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for coming. And what's the best place for people to find out more about the campaign?
And please follow me on Twitter, Zephyr Teachout on Twitter. And we have both my private and campaign, my private public, and our campaign Facebook pages. And my website is zephyrteachout.com. Right now we are actively petitioning. There's a lot of, speaking of grassroots energy, there's a lot of grassroots activity all across the state of New York, and I'd love for people to get involved. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for joining us today. That does it for this edition of Disorderly Conduct. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at DIS_CON. Like us on Facebook, subscribe, and rate us on iTunes and Stitcher. We'll catch you next time.